At 28,000 feet above the storm-lashed black waters of the Darwin Cordillera, where a subpolar supercell whipped 90-knot Patagonian gales into a blinding vortex of frozen salt crust and pulverized volcanic ash, the twin-engine F-117, a Nighthawk, was 4 seconds from slicing, inverted into the sea. An unforecasted electrostatic pulse from an ionized volcanic caldera plume had shattered the strike fighter's faceted composite radome at Mach 0. Joe Sherrar. Instantly fusing the quad-redundant digital fly-by-wire flight control computers into smoking silicon and severing the primary high-pressure hydraulic routing lines running through the lower fuselage keel. Inside the pressurized flight deck, the faceted cockpit canopy framing imploded with an ear-splitting crack, filling the cockpit with an explosive hurricane of -45-degree wind, pulverized acrylic glass, and scalding 3,000 psi hydraulic mist. On the front flight deck, the detachment flight commander sat slumped against the left console, his corneas flash-blinded by caustic de-icing glycol and arterial blood gushing from a fractured temporal bone. His dead-weight combat boots jamming the directional rudder pedals into a hard left yaw while the 52,000-pound aerodynamically unstable stealth fighter plunged into an uncommanded 75-degree inverted dive toward the jagged basalt sea stacks at 9,000 feet per minute. 6 miles to the south, pinned on an isolated gravel spit beneath 900-foot vertical cliffs, 28 Allied special reconnaissance operators and wounded intelligence officers were down to their final rifle magazines. Their defensive perimeter, crumbling beneath 30mm autocannon fire from 2 advancing, stealth missile gunboats. Every automated flight envelope limiter was dead. The primary glass flight displays were drowned in freezing red hydraulic oil. And the Combined Air Operations Center 300 miles away at Mount Pleasant Air Station was already reaching to transmit the mission loss code to the Pentagon. But in the unheated rear cockpit of the modified 2-seat evaluation aircraft, where she had spent 8 long months checking high-altitude pressure suits and oxygen regulators with an analog micrometer, while wearing a strip of faded black friction tape over the name tag on her work coveralls, a 38-year-old civilian contract airframe integrity rigger with an 8-inch titanium spinal fusion dropped her diagnostic tablet, pulled a pair of combat-scarred Nomex flight gloves from her canvas parka, and hauled the emergency mechanical flight control disconnect lever upward until the steel shear pins snapped. The civilian contractor staging annex on the northern perimeter of Mount Pleasant Air Station sat on a wind-scoured promontory of black basalt and permafrost overlooking the South Atlantic, smelling perpetually of damp wool, stale black coffee, and the bitter, coppery stench of scorched synthetic turbine oil baking against uninsulated corrugated steel. It was an ouster, weather-beaten outpost carved into the subpolar rocks, where the Air Force's Forward Tactical Evaluation Detachments and Electronic Warfare Wings staged high-readiness maritime reconnaissance sweeps along the storm-lashed Drake Passage. In the brutal winter months, when the polar night swallowed the runway for 20 hours a day and 90-knot willy-waw gales battered the flight line, the active-duty strike pilots who flew the modernized stealth attack jets measured their standing by their flight hours. Their pristine, custom-tailored G-suits, and their absolute, unyielding faith in the automated glass cockpits, digital fly-by-wire flight envelope limiters, and computerized threat evasion software installed during the latest fleet modernization program. They saw Tamsin Ferreira as an unglamorous utility laborer who belonged in the suit maintenance pits. They saw a woman of 38 who stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, whose dark hair was pulled into an austere, functional knot flecked with silver at the temples, and whose gait carried a slow, mechanical stiffness in her lower thoracic spine and right hip. They saw someone who spent 14 hours a day kneeling on grease-stained concrete, checking the seating clearances on high-altitude pressure suit helmet neck rings with dial micrometers, measuring the hydraulic seals on the General Electric F404 turbofan bleed valves with brass feeler gauges, wiping synthetic hydraulic fluid from titanium Elevon mixer linkages with solvent-soaked rags, and hauling 50-pound lead test calibration boxes across the hangar floor without speaking. She rarely made a sound. When addressed by active-duty strike pilots or flight commanders, she answered with short, clipped nods or simple pencil marks on the maintenance logs. Whenever the younger frontline fighter officers strode past in their tailored flight gear and custom leather jackets, laughing and boasting about their automated terrain-following radar runs and computerized precision bombing scores, she stepped back against the corrugated bulkheads with her chin lowered, waiting silently for the corridor to clear. She ate her cold meals alone on an empty wooden turbine crate behind the drop tank storage revetments, reading worn technical monographs on non-linear vortex fluid dynamics, faceted airframe post-stall pitch coupling, and unaugmented mechanical flight control cable tensioning, while the younger pilots gathered around the ready room monitors to review their automated simulator profiles. They did not see the woman who had written the United States Air Force and Navy Joint Extreme Energy Air Combat Maneuvering Doctrine and Manual Reversion Recovery Syllabus in her own blood over the Southern Oceans. Beneath the collar of her heavy waffle-knit thermal undershirt, resting against her sternum on a loop of gutted olive-drab parachute cord, was a scorched, twisted titanium trailing-edge Elevon mixer hinge pin, stamped with the classified serial number of an experimental faceted stealth testbed that had officially been reduced to scrap 9 years ago. Across her shoulder blades and down her right rib cage ran a 14-inch surgical track where military orthopedic trauma surgeons had fused 4 crushed thoracic vertebrae with titanium stabilization plates and reconstructed her pelvic ring after an explosive zero-altitude combat crash during an emergency tactical extraction in eastern Syria. Nobody at Mount Pleasant asked about the scar, and nobody wondered why a civilian suit rigger possessed an intuitive, terrifyingly precise grasp of twin turbofan asymmetric yaw-roll coupling, unstable faceted wing lift-to-drag polars, and wave trough ground effect air cushions that made the wing's top weapons school graduates look like novices. Major Dennis Apex Vance certainly never asked. At 34, Vance was the strike detachment's prized flight commander and elite. High-time weapons school, graduate with razor-sharp cheekbones, immaculate tactical flight gear, and an absolute unyielding faith in the automated fly-by-wire flight envelope limiters, computerized active radar target trackers, and satellite-guided precision munitions of the modernized F-117A Nighthawk to Vance. Modern low-altitude interdiction was an exercise in sterile digital management. The aircraft's computerized flight directors, automated, carefree handling algorithms, and digital data links were designed to eliminate the need for the brutal, instinctual, stick and rudder muscle memory of the past. The era of the old stealth cowboys wrestling mechanical sticks through storm turbulence to eyeball bomb lines through grease marks on the windscreen is dead. Fajita. Vance had scoffed that very morning in the tactical planning trailer, tapping his gold stylus against the interactive digital map while the junior flight officers chuckled behind him. This modernized Nighthawk flies on computerized carefree flight control algorithms. The digital avionics suite calculates our radar clearance plane, automated G-limiting, and standoff release points in microseconds. You just make sure our internal high-altitude suit regulators don't throw diagnostic parity errors and our Elevon strain gauges stay calibrated. And we'll handle the real combat flying. You're only on this manifest because the Air Force Materiel Command Evaluation Mandate requires a certified civilian suit technician on board this modified two-seat evaluation airframe to log vibration harmonics during this live tracking maritime sweep. Stay in the rear seat. Keep your grease-stained hands off the flight stick. And try not to panic when the radar warning receiver chirps. Tamsin had stood by the briefing table, her canvas tool bag held loosely in her scarred hands, her pale hazel eyes holding a stillness so absolute, so devoid of human vanity, that Vance had involuntarily broken eye contact. The low-altitude thermal boundary layer over the Darwin Sea Canyon does not read your software manuals. Major, she had said, her voice dropping into a low, dry cadence that carried no edge. When that 90-knot polar front collides with the 1,200-degree volcanic plume rising from the seabed fissure, it creates an extreme localized standing rotor wave that compresses the air density across the basalt sea cliffs by 28% in 2 seconds. The barometric pressure inside the coastal channel has collapsed by 34 millibars since dawn. The limestone walls and freezing sea spray will refract your targeting pod's laser designators, creating a 60-meter target offset on your digital displays. The radar-directed 30mm flak battery on the covert littoral corvette is operating in passive optical slave mode, tracking your data link emissions while waiting for you to unmask. If your automated flight control system attempts to hold a standard 3-degree descent while passing through that density shear, the computer will lag behind the dynamic pressure drop, stall the high-pressure engine compressors, and drop the airframe into the water before your General Electric turbofans can spool to climb power. Vance had let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed off the steel briefing lockers. Thanks for the fluid mechanics lecture, suit washer. But I have 1,400 hours in digital strike cockpits and an advanced degree in computational aerospace engineering from Stanford. When I want tactical advice from someone who wipes sweat off oxygen masks, I'll submit a work order to logistics. Keep your mouth shut during the sortie. Tamsin had said nothing. She had merely turned, zipped her heavy canvas parka, and walked out into the pre-dawn wind on the flight line. What Major Vance did not know what was sealed inside a triple redacted, black-inked dossier locked inside the Special Access Vault at Air Combat Command Headquarters and the Air Force Test Center under the codename times Project Pale, Kestrel times, was that Tamsin Ferreira had logged 800 combat and experimental flight hours at the low-altitude controls of the F-117A, the F-15E Strike Eagle, the F-16 CJ Wild Weasel, and experimental aerodynamically unstable stealth test beds. She had flown 32 deep penetration tactical suppression sweeps and extreme threat close air support missions under active surface-to-air missile fire before Vance had even earned his flight cadet wings. She was the legendary command test pilot who, during a catastrophic night ambush in the Euphrates River Valley in 2017, had brought a battle-shredded burning strike fighter through an integrated radar-guided missile belt with one engine shot away, 0 automated flight control computers, and her cockpit canopy shattered by 23mm flak, personally hand-flying the 52,000-pound aircraft 20 feet above, 40-foot ocean swells by raw mechanical cable tension, to destroy 3 active radar sites with manual rocket passes, saving 36 trapped soldiers before dead-sticking the aircraft safely onto an unpaved desert highway. The military had awarded her the Air Force Cross in a closed-door Pentagon ceremony, medically retired her after surgeons reconstructed her shattered lumbar spine with titanium plates, classified the entire operation under an executive national security order to protect manual reversion faceted airframe recovery envelopes, and offered her an administrative desk job in Maryland. She had refused the desk, She had taken the civilian contractor job with the depot structural maintenance division because she could not bear to live away from the smell of burning JP-8 aviation fuel. The high-pitched, earth-shaking howl of twin General Electric F 404 non-afterburning turbofans, producing 21,600 pounds of thrust, and the massive, armored air dominance warship that lived in the terrifying boundary layer, where physical aerodynamics met the unyielding limits of human will. She had accepted the obscurity. She had let them call her a suit washer. She had let the world forget that the call sign, Kestrel, had ever ruled the hostile mountain sky. Now, as the F-117, a designated times Ghost 01, times plunged into the roaring black abyss of the Darwin Cordillera. The subpolar storm was preparing to demand a price that no computer could ever calculate. The catastrophe detonated 40 miles northwest of Cape Horn, deep inside the suffocating, radar-blind corridor of the Beagle Narrows. An Allied Special Reconnaissance Detachment, consisting of 18 operators from Navy SEAL, Team 2, and 10 combat controllers, along with wounded intelligence officers, had been ambushed on an isolated basalt reef while extracting a captured naval signal processor, an adversary littoral combat group, consisting of a heavily armed stealth missile corvette equipped with an AK-176MA 76mm naval cannon, 2 high-speed armored assault gunboats armed with twin 30mm autocannons, and a Pantsir ME surface-to-air missile battery concealed inside a natural granite sea cave notch, had severed the maritime evacuation route. Pinned on a 40-yard strip of frozen volcanic gravel between 50-foot boiling ocean swells and vertical 900-foot basalt sea cliffs, the friendly force was taking continuous, heavy, plunging fire. 12 operators were critically wounded. Their evacuation rigid hull inflatable boats had been pulverized by 30mm explosive rounds, and their defensive ammunition had dwindled to their final rifle magazines. Mayday. Mayday. Any tactical strike asset on the Southern Maritime Guard net. This is Trident Lead on Emergency Satellite Relay, the frantic voice of Master Sergeant Jesse Connolly, the team's lead Joint Terminal Attack Controller, screamed over the encrypted radio channel, his words broken by violent, ragged coughing. We are completely pinned on the outer basalt spit. Hostile gunboats have established overlapping fields of fire 40 meters from our casualty collection point. The Pantsir battery on the corvette has locked down the entire air corridor. We have 28 souls on this rock. If we do not get heavy close air support and air-to-surface suppression in the next 2 minutes, every single one of us is going to be slaughtered. Major Vance. Commanding times. Ghost 01 times at 28,000 feet above the thick coastal overcast. Had accepted the emergency strike mission with supreme confidence over the tactical frequency. He assured the Combined Air Operations Center at Mount Pleasant that the Nighthawk's modernized glass cockpit, internal forward-looking infrared, FLIR targeting turret, and internal weapons bay carrying 2 2,000-pound GBU 27 Paveway 3 laser-guided bunker penetrator bombs would allow them to descend through the cloud base, lock onto the hostile naval vessels, destroy the threat from standoff range, and climb back out over the mountains without ever exposing the stealth airframe to small arms fire. Trident Lead. This is Ghost 01. Vance radioed, his voice sounding polished and relaxed over the encrypted channel. We are descending through 20,000 feet into the maritime corridor. Airspeed, 420 knots. FLIR targeting turret is scanning the surface threat envelope. engaging automated low-altitude flight director and slaving our precision munitions to the primary naval radar emitter. Keep your heads down and get ready for the strike. From the jump seat in the rear cockpit behind the main avionics bulkhead, Tamsin Ferreira looked at the raw barometric pressure gradient and air density readouts scrolling across her portable diagnostic tablet. Her pale hazel eyes narrowed into sharp focus. "Major," Tamsin said, her voice cutting through the cockpit intercom with sudden, surgical clarity. "Look at the localized barometric lapse rate on the auxiliary sensor. The ambient air density inside this maritime trench has collapsed by 34 millibars in the last 15 minutes due to the volcanic thermal plume. You are flying directly into an active orographic chimney. The Corvette's phased array target acquisition radar is operating in low-frequency passive track mode, using the vertical basalt sea cliffs as natural reflectors to blind your radar's side lobe cancellers. If you attempt an automated high-speed descent at 420 knots with the autopilot coupled, the sudden density collapse will trip your digital flight control limiters. Freeze your weapon interface and drop the airframe into the water before your General Electric turbofans can spool to climb power." Vance didn't turn his head. His voice snapped back through her headset, dripping with condescension. "Ferreira, I told you to stay in the back and watch the diagnostic bus. The modernized FLIR targeting system calculates dynamic multipath reflections 50 times a second. I am the flight commander. And I don't need a suit washer telling me how to run a suppression profile." He pushed both throttle levers forward into maximum continuous power, lowered the heavy faceted nose, and dived the 52,000-pound air dominance fighter straight down into the boiling, pitch-black clouds of the coastal blizzard. The transition from the calm air of 28,000 feet to the violent throat of the Beagle Narrows was an instantaneous descent into a toxic blast furnace. The moment the Nighthawk dropped below 600 feet above the raging sea, the world vanished into a terrifying storm of horizontal sea spray, howling 85-knot Arctic gale force winds, and vertical black basalt sea cliffs flashing past 20 yards from the 43-foot swept wingtips. The violent mountain rotor waves, colliding with the rising volcanic thermal moisture, created massive standing waves of turbulent air that battered the aerodynamically unstable airframe with the physical impact of continuous artillery fire. "Targeting display is blooming on the sea spray clutter," yelled the weapons officer on the tactical link, his voice cracking as the twin turbofans groaned against the dense, salt-heavy air. "I've lost visual with the littoral Corvette. The automated fire control computer is throwing critical sensor parity errors. Airspeed is decaying through 300 knots. "Hold the attack heading!" Vance shouted back over the deafening scream of the slipstream. "Arm, Master, arm. Select GBU-27 penetrator bombs. Prepare for automated release." He never got the chance to pull the trigger. From the concealed sea channel carved between two towering basalt islands, 2 miles ahead, the Corvette's Panzer-Me air defense system transitioned from passive tracking to active continuous wave illumination with blinding, multi-gigawatt power. Beep, 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 beep. The analog radar warning receiver in the cockpit shrieked with an unbroken, continuous audio squeal. Hard rudder lock. Surface-to-air missile spike. Terminal guidance active. The naval battery fired a salvo of 257 E6 solid fuel two-stage interceptor missiles from its vertical launch canisters. Hoo! Osh! Roar! The two multi-stage missiles accelerated from 0 to Mach 4, 5 in 1.2 seconds, arcing through the blizzard directly toward the Nighthawk's nose at 3,800 feet per second. Simultaneously, a massive electrostatic discharge generated by the ionized volcanic ash and sub-zero squall struck the composite nose radome with an ear-splitting times crack, The 60,000-volt surge tore through the forward avionics bay, instantly fusing the primary flight control computers, the digital head-up display processors, the DLIR turret drives, and the central electrical buses into smoking slag. A violent electrical arc ruptured the cockpit de-icing fluid line running beneath the glare shield. A geyser of pressurized, scalding glycol fluid and shattered acrylic glass blasted directly into Major Vance's face and eyes. Vance took the full blast of the scalding chemical spray and glass shrapnel across his face, eyes, and throat. Caustic fluid and glass shards stripped his night vision goggles away, blinding him instantly, while a jagged fragment severed his left temporal artery. A fountain of bright arterial blood sprayed across the broken glare shield, freezing and boiling on the instrument panels within seconds. Vance screamed a raw, strangled cry of pure agony as his hands clawed frantically at his ruined eyes, his boots thrashing helplessly against the directional rudder pedals as he convulsed in shock. "I can't see! My eyes! I'm blind!" Vance shrieked into the howling gale, his voice cracking into pure hysteria. "The flight computers are dead. The radar is burned out. The missiles are on our nose. We're spinning. We're hitting the sea." To compound the nightmare, the sudden electrical failure caused the automated digital fly-by-wire flight control computers to crash into an unrecoverable failure loop. "Beep, beep, beep! Flight controls offline!" Dual electrical depletion. Radar failure. Direct law active. Sync rate. Bank angle. With the flight stick jammed full forward by Vance's convulsing body and the twin turbofans screaming in unaugmented thrust, the 52,000-pound aircraft entered a violent, descending graveyard spiral, plunging toward the freezing 50-foot breakers of the Pacific at 9,000 feet per minute. Terran, pull up. Pull up. Water proximity. The automated ground proximity warning system screamed its frantic mechanical death chant. But there was no one in the front seat capable of flying the airplane. Through the tactical link, 16 data link, 300 miles away inside the Combined Air Operations Center bunker at Mount Pleasant, Colonel Arthur Sterling watched the master situational display flash catastrophic crimson. The strike fighter's transponder telemetry showed an uncommanded dive rate of 9,200 feet per minute. Total flight control computer failure. Terminal SAM illumination. And airspeed accelerating past 440 knots toward the granite cliffs. Colonel Sterling snatched his master radio microphone, his hand shaking violently. "Ghost 01. This is Mount Pleasant Command. We show total flight control computer failure, terminal SAM illumination, and uncontrolled descent into terrain. Mission is aborted! Flight crew. Initiate emergency tandem ejection immediately. Command terminates the suppression mission." On the freezing reef, 60 feet below, Master Sergeant Jesse Connolly heard the death sentence over his tactical radio. He looked up through the swirling spray and saw the smoke-trailing faceted stealth fighter tumbling out of the clouds, banking steeply toward the vertical rock wall, while hostile gunboats opened fire with 30mm cannons 20 yards from his dying perimeter. "No!" Connolly screamed into his radio, tears freezing on his soot-blackened cheeks as enemy rounds spattered against his armor. "Don't punch out if you abandon this strike. 28 people die on this rock in 2 minutes. Ghost 01. Pull up." Inside the freezing, blood-spattered rear cockpit of the falling aircraft, Tamsin Ferreira didn't hesitate. She didn't look for an officer. She didn't ask for permission. She unclipped her harness, grabbed her heavy canvas toolkit, reached past the severed wiring bundles, and took hold of the dual flight controls in the rear cockpit. The scene that met her eyes would have paralyzed any civilian aviator on Earth. The forward cockpit canopy was an open vortex of -20-degree wind howling through shattered acrylic seams, freezing the pooling blood and hydraulic fluid on the floorboards into slick, dark ice. The digital multi-function flight displays were dead, shattered by shrapnel and drowned in fluid. The secondary backup attitude indicator, a tiny 2-inch mechanical gyro ball on the lower glare shield, was spinning wildly, struggling to find a horizon in the violent convective chop. Major Vance was thrashing blindly in the front seat, his face covered in chemical burns and blood, his hands clawing at his ruined eyes as he screamed into his mask. The airspeed indicator was screaming through 460 knots, well past the maximum low-altitude structural maneuvering velocity, $V, $, of the unboosted airframe in turbulent maritime air. The massive, diamond-faceted swept wings, carrying 22,000-pound GBU, 27 Paveway 3, laser-guided bunker penetrator bombs in the internal weapons bay. 2 AIM, 9 L sidewinders in side carriage, and an internal 20mm M61A, 1 Vulcan rotary cannon, were flexing upward by over 3 feet at the tips, vibrating with violent elevon flutter that threatened to shear the wing spars clean off the fuselage. The black, frothing crests of 50-foot ocean breakers and the jagged basalt sea cliffs of the coastline were barely 400 feet below and rising at 140 feet per second. Pull up, bank angle, bank angle. Tamsin didn't look at the warning lights. She didn't listen to the alarms. She slammed her heavy combat boots squarely onto the titanium rudder pedals in the rear cockpit, reached down to the center pedestal, and grabbed the heavy manual mechanical reversion flight control disconnect lever. With a primal scream of physical exertion, she yanked the emergency disconnect handle upward until the steel shear pins snapped. Clack clank. She stripped the aircraft of every electronic fly-by-wire servo and unboosted hydraulic valve, dropping the 52,000-pound supersonic capable faceted warship into raw, unaugmented manual mechanical cable and pulley, direct flight control law, direct law, to fly an F-117A Nighthawk in raw mechanical cable reversion at 460 knots inside a 200-foot wide sea gorge was considered an absolute aerodynamic impossibility by every flight manual ever written. The F-117 is an aerodynamically unstable airframe in all 3 axes, without computerized flight control, computers correcting its giant all-moving V-tail ruddervators and trailing-edge elevons 40 times a second. The aircraft naturally wants to pitch up violently, depart controlled flight, and tear itself to pieces in the slipstream. Without hydraulic computer boost, the aerodynamic forces acting upon the massive faceted elevons created over 180 pounds of raw physical resistance against the flight stick. Tamsin planted both heels into the aluminum floorboards, locked her knees, and hauled the massive control stick backward and right with every ounce of physical strength in her back, shoulders, and core. Her reconstructed lumbar and thoracic spine, the titanium stabilization rods, and fused bone fragments screamed in blinding, white-hot oggin. The surgical scar tissue along her lower ribs felt as though it were being torn open with red-hot wire. Tamsin bit down on her lower lip until blood filled her mouth, locked her elbows, and held the heavy stick against her ribs. "Come on, you big black diamond," she growled through her teeth. "Fly." The thick steel control cables beneath the floorboards groaned under immense mechanical tension. stretching against their heavy titanium pulleys. Tamsin didn't just pull with her arms, she slammed her right boot into the titanium rudder pedal with explosive force, while simultaneously shoving both General Electric F404 turbofans into maximum emergency continuous power. The massive faceted wings bit into the freezing maritime air. The 52,000-pound aircraft groaned, the composite skin along the faceted facets rippling as she pulled an eye-watering 6 positive Gs at 450 knots. The belly of Time's Ghost 01 Times cleared the frothing crest of a 50-foot ocean breaker by less than 15 feet. The colossal wake turbulence from the twin turbofans tore a 400-foot trench of vaporized seafoam across the black water, stripping the foam from the wave crests and leaving a boiling white scar that stretched for 2 miles behind the aircraft. Tamsin held the climb, her boots vibrating violently against the pedals as the airframe clawed its way back up to 200 feet, leveling off inside the narrow visual corridor beneath the storm clouds. She reached up with her left hand, wiped the freezing blood and hydraulic fluid from her eyes, and reached for the master radio panel. Her fingers found the UHF tactical switch without looking, locking it on to the International Emergency Guard Net 121, 5 megahertz. Her voice, when she keyed the mic, was smooth, level, and colder than the Arctic gale howling through the shattered windshield. Mount Pleasant Command. This is Ghost 01 rear seat. Tamsin Ferreira, broadcast across the theater network. Cancel your bailout directive. We are on station at 200 feet. The ground detachment is under my protection. Inside the Combined Air Operations Center bunker at Mount Pleasant, Colonel Arthur Sterling dropped his tactical radio handset. It bounced off the floorboards. The entire operations floor. 50 tactical air controllers, intelligence analysts, and strike planners went completely dead. Staring at the primary situational display, where the flashing red icon of Times, Ghost 01 Times, had suddenly stabilized at 200 feet above the water, tracking northeast along the Beagle Narrows at 420 knots. Colonel Sterling lunged back to his console, his face purple with rage. Ghost 01! Who is this? Identify yourself immediately. Major Vance is the designated flight commander. That is an unauthorized civilian voice on a top-secret military command frequency. I ordered an immediate emergency ejection. Who is flying that aircraft? Tamsin didn't flinch. She adjusted the mechanical Elevon pitch trim wheel with her left hand, feeling the subtle, violent vibration of the unstable, faceted airframe through the control stick. Colonel Sterling, she said, her voice carrying the cold, immovable authority of a master who had conquered skies he had never dreamed of. Major Vance is blinded with an arterial bleed and facial trauma. I have assumed command of this aircraft. If I abandon the station, 28 Special Forces operators and wounded personnel on that reef will be slaughtered by hostile gunboats in the next 2 minutes. I am not abandoning them. Now clear this frequency of administrative garbage. Authenticate my position, and put me through to Trident Lead on the ground. Sterling stammered, his authority cracking like dry glass. You're the suit rigger. You're the contractor from the Mount Pleasant shed. You have zero legal authority to touch a frontline stealth strike fighter. I will have you court-martialed. On the burning reef below, Master Sergeant Jesse Connolly was huddled behind the smoking hull of a shattered patrol boat, holding his tactical radio handset against his ear as enemy 30mm rounds tore through the sheet metal inches from his head. He had listened to the radio exchange. He had heard that flat, rhythmic, unhurried cadence, a voice that sounded like heavy iron sliding over granite. A memory from 8 years ago, locked in the deepest vault of Connolly's soul. detonated in his mind like a flashbang. He remembered a midnight inferno in the Euphrates River Valley in 2017. He remembered 36 Green Berets surrounded by an enemy regiment with zero ammunition, listening to the death rattle of their last heavy machine gun. He remembered a lone, battle-shredded strike fighter that had flown through an integrated missile belt 20 feet above 40-foot ocean swells in manual cable reversion, guided by a pilot whose voice over the radio had sounded exactly like this, a voice that made dying men believe they were going to see tomorrow. Connolly keyed his handset, his voice shaking with a sudden, overwhelming surge of raw awe that brought tears to his eyes. Euphrates. 2017. Connolly whispered into the microphone, his hands trembling against the cold steel. The pilot who brought down the entire heavy fighter through an integrated SAM belt to extract the 3rd Special Forces Group, who destroyed 3 radar sites in manual cable reversion, who flew an unaugmented supersonic bird 20 feet above 40-foot waves. Connolly choked back a sob. Is that Kestrel? Tamsin adjusted her headset with her bloodied fingers. Her eyes locked on the narrow basalt notch rushing toward her canopy. Trident lead, Tamsin said softly. This is Kestrel. I'm back on the stick. Jesse, get your people flat behind the rocks. I'm rolling in for the missile pass. A silence fell across the tactical command frequency, so profound that for 6 seconds, the only audible sound was the distant roar of the storm and the crackle of atmospheric static. In the Mount Pleasant operations bunker, Colonel Sterling's hand remained frozen in mid-air above his console. Behind him, the commander of 8th Air Force and Allied strike operations, a gray-haired 4-star general named Douglas Vance. Dennis Vance's uncle stepped forward and pushed the dispatch director aside. The general frantically typed a master override code into a classified terminal, pulling up an encrypted dossier sealed under 5 red ink bars and the classification code times Project Pale Kestrel, special access only. On the screen flashed a photograph of a younger Tamsin Ferreira standing in front of an F-117A at Tonopah Test Range, wearing the flight suit of a Master Special Operations Combat Flight Evaluator, the Air Force Cross pinned above her left pocket. Beneath the photograph was a single block of unredacted text. Call sign, Kestrel. Qualification, Chief Instructor Pilot. USAF Weapons, School, Stealth, and Unstable Airframe Evaluation Division. Recipient of the Air Force Cross for unprecedented heroism in zero-visibility manual reversion, radar suppression missions. Highest anti-radiation missile accuracy and surface-to-air missile evasion survivability rating in military aviation history. General Vance slowly lowered his head, the color draining completely from his face. He looked at Colonel Sterling, whose mouth was hanging open in stunned disbelief. My God, General Vance whispered, his voice trembling with raw humility. She wasn't a suit washer. We had the greatest stealth strike tactician in military aviation history inspecting oxygen masks in the shed. General Vance stepped up to the master microphone and keyed the fleet transmitter himself. Kestrel? This is General Vance, the old officer said, his voice stripped of all bravado, trembling with profound respect. My nephew Dennis is in that front seat, and 28 of our finest Allied warriors are on that reef. The sky is yours. Commander, kill that battery and bring our children home. In the cockpit of the Nighthawk, Tamsin didn't smile. She didn't have time for sentiment. Ahead lay the first of 6 mortal tactical crises that stood between 28 dying soldiers and survival. The 2 multi-stage 5.7E6 E missiles from the Panzer Me battery traveling at Mach 4, 3,000 800 feet per second were at 3 miles, descending through the blizzard directly toward the Nighthawk's nose. Time to impact, 1.2 seconds. In standard air defense doctrine, an aircraft locked by a Pantsir system at 3 miles at low altitude was mathematically dead. Chaff was useless. The system's dual-band optical tracking channels discarded all radar clutter. Tamsin Ferreira didn't turn away. She didn't deploy chaff. She executed a masterstroke of tactical supersonic ballistics, the Times kinematic basalt stack Doppler notch, holding heading 030. She whispered to herself. She dropped the Nighthawk's sharp nose, diving the stealth strike fighter to within 15 feet of the boiling ocean surface, accelerating the airframe from 420 knots to 540 knots, Mach 0, 88 at sea level. She aligned the fighter's faceted keel directly with a massive 600-foot vertical basalt sea stack known as the Horn of Magellan, which jutted out from the eastern channel mouth in a solid sheer sheet of rock. She flew the aircraft on an exact collision course with the solid stone pillar at 540 knots. The two hypersonic missiles, calculating the lead collision intercept point, adjusted their trajectories to meet the Nighthawk at the rock face. Distance to the granite pillar, 500 yards. 200 yards. 50 yards. Closing speed, Mach 5. 3 combined. Time to impact, 0.6 seconds. At 30 yards from the solid basalt face, crossing the boundary at 540 knots, Tamsin executed the decisive against doctrine masterstroke. She slammed her left boot into the titanium rudder pedal, hauled the heavy control stick hard back and to the left, and popped the mechanical trailing edge elevons. The F-117A executed a violent 6G knife edge rolling snap slice, carving a razor-sharp arc around the outer edge of the basalt sea stack, clearing the rock face by barely 4 feet. The two 57E6E missiles, traveling at Mach 4.5 with massive forward kinetic momentum, could not execute a 90-degree turn inside a 30-yard radius. Both multi-stage missiles slammed directly into the vertical basalt face of the Horn of Magellan at 3,000 miles per hour. Kaboo-om! A colossal 200-foot fireball of burning solid rocket propellant and pulverized volcanic basalt erupted into the blizzard. The detonation blew 6,000 tons of rock into the sea, completely obliterating the rock face in a massive shockwave that shook the entire coastal channel. The blast wave slapped the Nighthawk's empennage, rocking the supersonic fighter violently. But Tamsin had already anticipated the heave, catching the roll with a surgical stab of right rudder and leveling the wings 20 feet above the water. Missiles defeated, Tamsin muttered, her breathing perfectly measured, her voice carrying zero adrenaline tremor. And at that exact microsecond, the second and third mortal crises arrived simultaneously. The littoral stealth corvette inside the Granite Channel 2 miles ahead immediately re-energized its Pantsir radar, preparing to launch a second 2-missile salvo, while its AK-176 meters 76mm rapid-fire naval cannon opened fire. The Nighthawk's digital fire control computers and automated weapon release interfaces were completely dead, burned out by the electrical surge. To destroy an armored naval vessel without automated targeting computers or digital weapons, release gates required executing an against-doctrine manual gravity drop, releasing 22,000-pound GBU, 27 Paveway 3 laser-guided bunker penetrator bombs in dumb ballistic free-fall mode using raw mechanical cable overrides in a 500-knot dive at 30 feet above the waves. "Vance!" Tamsin yelled through the front cockpit partition. Reach down to the right auxiliary console. Find the emergency manual store's release circuit breaker. Major Vance, his face covered in bloody bandages, fumbled blindly along the lower bulkhead. His trembling fingers found the heavy mechanical toggle. I have it. I have the breaker. On my mark. When I pull 40 degrees nose up, throw that toggle upward with all your strength, Tamsin commanded with surgical precision. It will dump raw 28-volt emergency battery power directly into the heavy weapons bay pneumatic actuators, bypassing the dead fire control computer. A manual battery dump on heavy bunker penetrators at 500 knots in manual direct law, Vance cried out. His voice cracked with pain. If the actuator binds, the bay doors will rip off unevenly and shear the main wing spars. They will not shear. Dennis, Tamsin said calmly, hold the toggle. You have 10 seconds. She leveled the fighter at 20 feet above the wave tops, heading straight down the throat of the illuminated naval radar beam at 540 knots. Distance to the corvette, 2 miles. 1 mile. Half a mile. She aligned the nose of the roaring fighter directly with the glowing phased array antenna dome visible above the ship's bridge. 3, 2, 1. Pull and throw, Tamsin roared. She hauled the heavy control stick straight back into her stomach, zooming the aircraft upward 40 degrees, while Major Vance slammed the emergency toggle upward. Whoosh clank. The internal weapons bay doors blew open into the 540-knot slipstream. Both 2,000-pound GBU, 2 7 bombs fell away from the internal trapeze racks in a synchronized mechanical release. The 4,000 pounds of heavy steel munitions sliced through the freezing air, falling in a clean, surgical ballistic arc directly toward the corvette's deck. 1.2 seconds later, both bombs struck the corvette's superstructure, radar, mast, and missile canisters simultaneously. Boom, kaboom, roar! 4,000 pounds of high-explosive tritonal warheads detonated across the ship's centerline, cooking off 16 ready surface-to-air missiles and 500 rounds of 76mm ammunition in a colossal 400-foot chain of fireballs. The massive detonation ripped the stealth corvette in half, sending the 40-ton radar mast 100 feet into the air and sinking the vessel in less than 30 seconds in a boiling cauldron of burning diesel and pulverized steel. The naval radar died instantly. The electronic sky went dead silent. Direct hit! The corvette is obliterated! The air defense network is destroyed! Connolly screamed over the radio, breaking down into ragged, weeping sobs of pure euphoria. Hit the gunboats! Hit the 30mm boats! And then, the fourth mortal tactical crisis arrived. On the frozen gravel spit below, the 2 armored littoral gunboats surged toward the Special Forces perimeter, their twin 30mm autocannons pouring relentless, plunging fire into the defensive boulders, closing to within 40 yards of the casualty collection point. Tamsin had 2 AIM, 9L Sidewinder infrared air-to-air missiles remaining in the side bays. But infrared air-to-air missiles cannot lock onto small maritime gunboats whose thermal signatures are drowned in cold sea spray and ground clutter. She had her internal 20mm M61 A1 Vulcan rotary cannon, loaded with 510 rounds of high-explosive armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, to destroy 2 armored gunboats 40 yards from friendly troops without automated gun reticles or computerized lead computation required flying 2 consecutive manual 500-knot low-altitude strafing passes inside a 200-foot sea gorge. Over the next 60 seconds, Tamsin Ferreira flew an epic masterclass in manual close air support that would be studied at the Fighter Weapons School for the next half-century. She had no digital head-up display. She had 20 years of ballistic muscle memory, an analog iron ring etched onto the glass framing, and her bare finger on the two-stage mechanical trigger. She engaged the two armored gunboats in rapid, continuous 500-knot low-altitude strafing passes, diving to within 20 feet of the freezing surf. Pass 1 direct burst into lead gunboat. A continuous 1-second burst of 250 rounds of 20mm depleted uranium shells ripped through the air at 3,600 feet per second with a deafening times brrr that shook the entire gorge. The heavy, armor-piercing rounds walked directly across the vessel's armored wheelhouse, ammunition locker, and engine deck. The kinetic energy detonated the internal 30mm ammunition magazines in a massive secondary explosion that blew the armored turret 40 feet into the sea and turned the vessel into a twisted, burning pyre of scrap metal that sank within seconds. Pass 2 direct, burst into second gunboat. The remaining 260 armor-piercing incendiary shells shredded the steel hull like wet cardboard, igniting the fuel cells and turning the second vessel into a burning ruin that rolled over into the surf. The hostile fire stopped instantly. The sea went dead silent. "Direct hit! Both gunboats destroyed! The hostile assault force is wiped out!" Connolly screamed over the radio, weeping openly in front of his entire team. "The perimeter is secure. We have 0 friendly casualties from your strafing passes. Kestrel." "You cleared the whole reef with the gun." "In the cockpit." Tamsin didn't celebrate, because at that exact microsecond, the 5th mortal crisis arrived. The sudden ingestion of dense shrapnel, pulverized steel debris, and burning propellant gas from the second gunboat explosion caused both General Electric F-404 turbofans to suffer catastrophic compressor disintegrations simultaneously. Bang, bang, bang. A series of violent, backfiring detonations shook the rear engine bays. The exhaust gas temperature, EGT, needles spiked instantly past 1,000 degrees Celsius into the catastrophic red zone. The engine's mechanical fuel governors cut fuel flow to prevent uncontained turbine disk disintegrations. Both General Electric F-404 turbofans flamed out and seized solid. The aircraft lost all forward thrust in a fraction of a second. While flying at 30 feet above the boiling breakers, the Nighthawk became an unpowered, 24,000-pound faceted glider falling through 30 feet above the water inside a narrow, dead-end gorge at 200 miles per hour. A vertical wall of solid black basalt barred the northern exit of the channel, the Darwin Headwall, rising 1,400 feet into the storm clouds. With both engines dead and her airspeed decaying through 160 knots after the heavy G strafing pullouts, the Nighthawk's unpowered glide rate was sinking toward the sea at 2,000 feet per minute. She was traveling at 165 knots, and the sheer rock face was expanding in her shattered windshield at 250 feet per second. She needed 600 feet of vertical climb to clear the granite saddle, and she had less than 4 seconds before impact. Minimum unpowered glide speed in manual direct law at this gross weight was 155 knots. Her airspeed was decaying rapidly through 158 knots. If she pulled back hard on the heavy control stick, the thin swept wings would stall, and the 24,000-pound aircraft would pancake into the solid stone cliff. In the Mount Pleasant bunker, General Douglas Vance closed his eyes, his hands gripping the console until his knuckles turned white. "She has no engine thrust," the general whispered in agony. "The unpowered glide gradient over a 1,400-foot wall is mathematically 0. She gave her life for those 28 soldiers." Tamsin Ferreira looked at the towering basalt wall rushing toward her canopy. She looked at a thermal fissure along the base of the western sea cliff, a geothermal vent venting superheated volcanic steam into the freezing sea. She did not accept death. She executed a maneuver that no flight simulator had ever been programmed to attempt. The times asymmetric, dynamic, aerodynamic ground effect slingshot. Hold on to the bulkhead. Dennis, Tamsin whispered. She did not pull the nose up to climb immediately. She shoved the control stick forward, diving the unpowered strike fighter to within 10 feet of the rising ocean foam at the base of the sea cliff, accelerating the airframe from 158 knots to 195 knots down the gravity chute. She used the high-velocity compressed air cushion trapped between the broad faceted wings and the rising mountain face, the ground effect cushion to support the aircraft's gross weight without inducing an aerodynamic stall. Then, 300 yards from the cliff face, Tamsin executed the masterstroke. She banked the aircraft 20 degrees to the left, diving directly into the core of the 1,200-degree geothermal updraft column rising from the volcanic vent. The colossal vertical thermal plume hit the composite wing surfaces like an invisible hydraulic elevator. The vertical speed indicator snapped from minus 800 feet per minute to plus 3. 200 feet per minute, without a single drop of engine thrust. The entire 24,000 pound aircraft was lifted vertically into the sky by pure atmospheric convection, gaining 800 feet of altitude in 12 seconds. And directly ahead of her lay the razor-sharp granite teeth of the ridge. Then, 80 yards from the cliff face, crossing the summit at 160 knots, Tamsin executed the decisive against doctrine masterstroke. She slammed her right boot into the titanium rudder pedal, dumped the remaining elevon trim forward, and threw the control stick 60 degrees to the right. The 24,000-pound warship sliced onto its right wingtip, executing a high-speed knife-edge contour roll along the diagonal spine of a natural notch in the basalt ridge. The belly of Time's Ghost 01 Times cleared the razor-sharp granite teeth of the Darwin headwall by less than 4 feet. The right wingtip missile rail actually clipped an overhanging pine branch on the summit, shearing the composite launcher faring away in a shower of brilliant sparks, before the aircraft vaulted over the Continental Divide into the open blue sky. The mountain dropped away beneath them. The suffocating, smoke-choked darkness of the Beagle Narrows vanished, replaced by the wide, open, sunlit expanse of the South Atlantic at 6,000 feet. She was in clear air. Tamsin Ferreira rolled the unpowered strike fighter smoothly back to wings-level flight, trimmed the deadstick aircraft for a clean, stable glide at 160 knots, and let the aircraft settle into a graceful, silent descent toward the emergency rough strip at Ushuaia. She keyed her radio on the tactical command net. Her breathing was slow, quiet, and perfectly measured. Ushuaia Tower. This is Ghost 01. Mission accomplished. Littoral corvette destroyed. Hostile gunboats eliminated. Ground detachment secured. Declaring emergency. Dual engine flameout. Total electrical failure. Blown windshield. And 2 medical casualties aboard. Inbound for deadstick forced landing on runway 07. After a long pause, the voice of the Ushuaia Tower controller crackled across the frequency. His tone hushed with profound, trembling reverence. Ghost 01. Ushuaia Tower. The entire runway is cleared for you. The entire sky is yours. Kestrel, bring our brothers home. And then, the 6th and final mortal tactical crisis arrived. Ahead lay Ushuaia Airfield, a 4,800-foot strip of cracked asphalt and packed volcanic gravel surrounded by snow-covered mountain ridges and the Beagle Channel. The surface wind across the runway was 35 knots, gusting to 48. Because the electrical and primary hydraulic systems were completely dead, the trailing edge elevons were locked immovable in their unboosted manual bypass positions. She had to execute a no-flap, dead-engine forced landing on a short runway in an 80-knot subpolar gale. Without flaps, the aircraft's minimum approach reference speed, $V, ref, $, skyrocketed from a normal 140 knots to a staggering 180 knots, touching down on a short strip at 180 knots with zero engine thrust, no hydraulic anti-skid brakes, and no nose-wheel steering was considered an absolute, unsurvivable landing scenario in every flight manual in the world. Worse, at 400 feet above the valley floor, half a mile from the threshold, Tamsin was 300 feet too high on the glide slope. If she dove the nose down to reach the numbers, the airspeed would accelerate past 210 knots, plowing the aircraft into the basalt blast berms at the far end of the runway. If she held her glide angle, she would float over the runway and crash into the fjord. Tamsin did not panic. She executed the forward side slip on final approach. Vance, brace yourself. Tamsin commanded with icy calm. I am crossing the controls. At 300 feet above the runway threshold, traveling at 180 knots, Tamsin executed the against doctrine masterstroke. She slammed her left boot into the titanium rudder pedal, shoving the massive V-tail rudder vaders 30 degrees to the left mechanical bump stop. Simultaneously, she threw the heavy control stick fully to the right, deflecting the right elevons upward. The 24,000-pound strike fighter twisted violently 30 degrees out of alignment with its flight path. The massive, faceted fuselage of the Nighthawk was thrown sideways into the 180-knot slipstream, presenting its entire 65-foot aluminum side directly to the rushing air, like a colossal aerodynamic sail. The aerodynamic drag was instantaneous and staggering. The vertical sink rate exploded from 700 feet per minute to an eye-watering 800 feet per minute. The aircraft plunged like an elevator through the coastal air, dumping 300 feet of excess altitude in 5 seconds without gaining a single knot of forward airspeed. At 50 feet above the runway, crossing the threshold at 160 knots, Tamsin released the rudder pedal and centered the control stick. The heavy aircraft snapped smoothly out of the side slip, its nose aligning perfectly with the runway centerline like a thrown javelin. Vance! Deploy the landing gear using the emergency pneumatic blowdown bottle, Tamsin ordered. Vance grabbed the red mechanical emergency gear release handle on the center console and hauled it upward until the steel shear pins snapped. Clunk, clunk, thud. Beneath the cockpit floor, the main landing gear and nose gear blew open under nitrogen pressure, locking into the down and locked position with 3 thunderous mechanical impacts. 3 green lights! Gear is down and locked, Vance yelled. Dropping the emergency drag chute manually, Tamsin shouted. She grabbed the emergency mechanical chute release handle beside the throttle quadrant and hauled it backward with both hands. Whoosh, clank. From the tail cone, the 16-foot ring slot deceleration parachute deployed into the slipstream. 10 feet. 5 feet. At 5 feet above the asphalt, floating across the threshold at 155 knots in total silence, Tamsin eased the control stick back 2 inches, allowing the ground effect air cushion to cushion their touchdown. Slam scree. The main landing gear tires slammed onto the asphalt centerline of runway 07 with the exquisite gentleness of a master artist laying down a brush. A colossal rooster tail of tire smoke, pulverized asphalt dust, and blue rubber billowed 80 feet into the howling gale behind the jet. The deployed deceleration chute caught the relative wind, violently slowing the heavy fighter, 140 knots, 100 Knots. 50 Knots. Because she had no automated anti-skid computers, she executed a manual differential rollout, balancing the unpowered fighter along the concrete, using alternating physical taps of the emergency, pneumatic toe brakes, and subtle deflections of the manual rudder. As the aerodynamic lift faded, she gently lowered the front tires onto the runway centerline. The Nighthawk rolled to a complete, dead stop on the asphalt centerline, exactly 25 yards short of the gravel overrun barrier, at the far end of the 4,800-foot runway. Silence returned to the cockpit. The only sound left in the world was the ticking of the cooling titanium airframe, the distant wail of emergency sirens racing across the tarmac, and the steady, unbroken breathing of a living aviator at the controls of her ship. Ghost 01 Times was home. All 28 Navy SEALs and intelligence officers on the reef and 2 crew members aboard were alive. Within 40 seconds, the runway was flooded by an armada of emergency rescue vehicles, structural crash fire trucks, and 4 field ambulances. The canopy was raised on its manual mechanical emergency latches. Trauma surgeons and paramedics scrambled up the mobile aluminum boarding ladder, carefully lifting Major Dennis Vance from the front cockpit onto a rigid spinal backboard, wrapping him in heated thermal blankets and carrying him down the stairs toward the waiting critical care ambulance. Major Vance was placed onto a wheeled stretcher on the tarmac. His face was swathed in sterile white gauze, his flight uniform soaked in dark blood and freezing de-icing fluid. As 2 flight surgeons began wheeling his stretcher toward the ambulance, Vance suddenly raised his trembling, uninjured right hand into the air, blindly searching the coastal wind. "Wait!" Vance choked out. His voice cracked with agonizing pain and overwhelming humility. "Wait! Stop the stretcher! Where is she? Where is Ferreira?" Tamsin was descending the steel boarding ladder on the rear left fuselage. Her face was smeared with carbon soot, dried blood, and gunpowder propellant residue. Her canvas work coveralls soaked in sweat and jet fuel, her hands bruised and trembling with exhaustion from wrestling 180 pounds of manual control tension for 2 hours. She walked over to the side of the stretcher. Vance turned his bandaged face toward the sound of her heavy boots on the concrete. He reached up with his shaking hand, fumbling at the Velcro patch on the left breast of his charred flight jacket. With a slow, agonizing tug, he tore off his prized, gold-embroidered Times, USAF Weapons School Instructor Times, patched the ultimate symbol of elite fighter aviation supremacy, and pressed it firmly into Tamsin's bruised palm. "I didn't fly that airplane." Vance wept openly, tears soaking through his eye, dressings in front of the entire assembled flight line. "And medical team, you flew an unaugmented stealth jet through an impossible flat canyon with dead engines. You saved my life. You saved 28 men on that reef. I am not worthy to wear this patch in your presence. Commander." Tamsin looked down at the gold patch in her hand, then gently reached out and closed his frostbitten fingers over it. "Keep your patch, Dennis," Tamsin said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that cut through the subpolar chill. "You stayed at your station when the canopy blew. You didn't panic and pull the ejection handle. That takes real courage. Just remember the lesson today. Computers are only tools, but the pilot is the weapon. Never forget how to feel the airplane with your own hands." As the medics wheeled Vance into the heated ambulance, Tamsin turned around. Standing on the floodlit tarmac behind her, flanked by 30 strike pilots, special operations commanders from the base garrison, and the entire base staff, was General Douglas Vance. The 4-star general did not look at her civilian contractor badge. He did not look at her grease-stained work coveralls. He snapped his heels together on the wet concrete, brought his right hand crisply to the brim of his service cap, and rendered a slow, trembling, textbook military salute. Behind him, 50 crew chiefs, mechanics, and suit riggers on the flight line snapped to attention, saluting the quiet technician who had stepped out of the maintenance shed to conquer an impossible mountain storm. Tamsin stopped at the base of the ladder. She met General Vance's eyes, gave him a slow, respectful nod of her head, and reached into the collar of her thermal undershirt. She pulled out the scorched titanium trailing edge Elevon mixer hinge pin hanging from its green parachute cord. With a slow, deliberate movement of her thumb, she peeled away the strip of faded black friction tape that had covered the left breast of her coveralls for the last 9 years. Underneath the tape, embroidered in gleaming silver thread upon a field of deep midnight black, were the golden wings of the Master Combat Flight Evaluator and a single, legendary call sign, Kestrel. From the flight line communications vehicle idling on the tarmac, the voice of the commander of Air Combat Command crackled across the loudspeaker from Langley Air Force Base. His tone hushed with supreme authority. All stations on this net, be advised, by direct executive order of the Secretary of Defense, the active flight status of Lieutenant Colonel Tamsin Ferreira is hereby restored to Chief of Tactical Strike Operations and Master Flight Evaluator for the Stealth Attack Fleet. Effective immediately. Clear the active runway. The Master has returned to her sky. From the tactical radio speaker on the base dispatch truck, the clear, unvarnished voice of Master Sergeant Jesse Connolly echoed across the tarmac from the extraction helicopter lifting off the Darwin Reef. Ushuaia Operations. This is Trident Lead. All 28 personnel are accounted for. Safe and airborne. Tell the pilot of Ghost 01 that 28 families are going to hold their loved ones tonight because of what she did in that gorge today. Tamsin Ferreira pulled her Nomex flight gloves from her hands, tucked them into her canvas tool kit, and turned toward the warm, yellow lights of the maintenance hangar. She was no longer the invisible suit washer. She was no longer the forgotten technician with the micrometer. She was the guardian of the tactical sky, and the Darwin Cordillera would remember her name forever. Tamsin Ferreira spent 9 long years hidden behind maintenance manifests, pressure suit calibration benches, and the dismissive arrogance of aviators who believed that automated flight computers had replaced the human soul of tactical aviation. But true mastery is not coded into software. And real courage does not require an audience to exist. When 28 human beings were trapped on a crumbling reef beneath an active missile battery and a crippled, burning stealth fighter was plunging toward 50-foot breakers with its engines dead, she didn't wait for permission. She stepped into the fire, took an unaugmented 52,000-pound warship in her bare hands, and used the raw physics of aerodynamic flight and unyielding human will to bring 30 human souls home alive. That is the mark of a true warrior, the kind who never boasts, the kind who never performs, but the kind who stands up when the impossible moment arrives and shows the world what real heroism looks like. If this breathtaking story of invisible mastery, unbreakable resolve, and the pilot who conquered an impossible Patagonian volcanic flak canyon to save 28 lives moved you today, please hit that like button, Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to the channel for more extraordinary stories of everyday heroes who answer the call when everything is on the line. Listen to the airplane. It always tells the truth. And we'll see you in the next one.